Welcome to Galveston Unscripted. Hello and welcome to Galveston Unscripted. On today's episode, we have a very special guest, Justice Ken Wise of Texas 14th Court of Appeals. Justice Ken Wise is also the host of Wise About Texas, the #1 Texas history podcast. That podcast, just like this one, is being used in classrooms to help educate, which I think is super fun, super important, makes me feel good. Justice Wise and I sit down and discuss podcasting, specifically Texas history podcasting. If this is your first time listening to Galveston Unscripted, we are transforming Galveston into the world's largest free museum, and Galveston Unscripted is your free audio guide. Justice Wise and I also discuss tons of Texas history. In this 30-minute episode, we are all over the map. So if you're listening to the audio-only version of this episode, head on over to YouTube or hop on Facebook. I'm going to have the video version of this episode with visual effects, just so you can kind of keep up with what we're talking about. If you're watching this on YouTube, please go subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. We are everywhere: Apple, Spotify, all the podcast platforms. And help us transform Galveston and Texas into the world's largest free museum. And if you haven't heard, Galveston Unscripted is the official podcast of Galveston, which is kind of a big deal for me since we've only been doing this for about a year and 3 months. So to sit down with Justice Wise was the biggest treat for me. And he was able to squeeze this in on short notice. Without further ado, let's hop into this very special episode with host of Wise About Texas, the #1 Texas history podcast, Justice Ken Wise. Welcome to Galveston Unscripted. Well, yeah, and I'll tell you how I got everything started. I left headphones out. It's usually 50-50. Some people wear them, some people don't. Don't worry about it. I don't want you to mess your hair up for...
Yeah, right. You need a level?
I leveled them out pretty well earlier.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good to go. That's great. Well, yeah, I'll tell you a little bit how I got started. And, of course, we'll keep this whole thing super casual. I just really appreciate you coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. It's great.
Yeah, of course. Well, so back in late 2019, my wife and I, we were living in downtown Galveston, a little loft area, and I decided, after seeing all these tours walking by all the time of this little loft area, I was like, I love telling people about Galveston history. I grew up in this area. I'm passionate about the history here, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I was on Instagram one day and I was scrolling through and I came across Boston running tours. I saw an ad for Boston running tours. I was like, man, that's fascinating. I've never heard of a running tour before. And a few weeks later, I was like, you know what? Galveston needs something like that because it's so historically dense and like a mile square, just right in this area to the East End Historic District. And I was like, well, I'm just going to start it. So I created an Instagram and started accepting bookings through Instagram. So I did it completely for free for a year just to kind of develop the whole tour, the 5K running tour. And I wasn't a tour guide. I just like to invite people and talk to strangers pretty much. So that was, and then of course, COVID happened shortly after that. I was working from home for a while and kind of got stir crazy and decided to create an audio guide out of the historic stops I had for that 5K running tour. Then the 5K running tour audio guide just expanded well beyond that 5K tour. And then I ended up putting those same audio guides on a podcast feed. And as soon as you put something on a podcast feed, people start finding it, related back to Texas history. And essentially, that was the evolution of Galveston Unscripted. So started having some interviews starting in October last year. Of course, used your podcast for inspiration for a lot of it.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. And, so we've had Mr. Sam Collins on. We've had Ed Cottom.
Well.
Yep.
Yeah. We had two.
Yep. So we've had, had them on to help tell the story of Galveston and how it relates to Texas and American history.
Yeah, well, it played such an integral part because it was the city, the big city for so long. I was listening to your interview with Maureen Patton on the way down here. I also know and love, and what a fascinating history podcast that was, just talking about the present day operations of the theater and the renovations. Takes you all the way through Texas history for over 100 years. It's amazing.
Yeah, I really had to. Maureen is amazing. I had to break out to a bonus episode just for her because you can hear the passion in her voice for all of that, and for performance, but that played, an integral role in late 1800s Galveston was
Absolutely.
performing, so, but yeah. So, again, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I know you have a big event going on at the Bryan Museum this evening.
Tonight, as we record, I'm going to have the honor of interviewing the great-great-grandson of Quanah Parker, the last war chief of the Comanche tribe, and his name is Nakona Burgess. And he is one of the premier Native American artists in the world, and happens to be a member of the Comanche Nation. And so he's going to give a talk at the Bryan. I'm going to facilitate it. He'll do the talking, and I'll do the facilitating. And they're going to follow that up with an auction of some of his art, but also some other art called Visions of the West. So it ought to be a great event.
Are you going to record that for your podcast?
They may give me the video from that for the YouTube channel, but he and I we just had lunch, and we're going to do a podcast. I'm probably going to travel to New Mexico during the Comanche dances and stuff near Taos, and we'll do it there. But because that's some history. I have gotten relatively recently a series of circumstances have come across my desk. Not just I published a journal article, a scholarly article on some American Indian matters and the Indian trial, which also turned into a 3-part podcast and that had to do with the Kiowa Indians tried in a civilian court for the first time in Texas, 1874, first time in the United States, that Indian raiders were tried in a civilian court. But really that story and my research has led me to become very involved in American Indian issues, both in my day job as a judge, where I'm involved with the American Law Institute and the law of the American Indian, and just a deeper understanding of the history of Indian-Anglo relations, because you really and I say you, I mean, we are taught that it was a history of conflict, and it certainly was, but what's missing from that is, what about the history of the Indian tribes themselves? And unfortunately, of course, they didn't record it. Mm-hmm. And so the traditional methods are not going to reveal a lot of the culture and intricacies of those tribes. We know about the war because the winners wrote the history, but we don't know about the Indian side really that mm-hmm. much. And so that's become very fascinating to me and somewhat sad, because it's they were just people acting in their interests also, certainly different culture. But I don't know. I've just become fascinated. So there's going to be a lot more of that on Wise About Texas in the future. But,
I'm excited.
I didn't mean to digress into
that. No, you're great.
Get me fired up. I've been talking about it for 2 hours. So.
I love it. No, I mean, that leads me to think about the local Indian tribe we had here, the Karankawa. Right. And back to 1528, Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca landed, whether it was on Galveston Island or close to it.
Right.
He encountered that tribe, right, or tribes associated. So it is fascinating. So, like, when people think of Texas history, a lot on your podcast, you're going back 200 years at least, right? But really, history goes back thousands of years, and even traceable firsthand accounts, at least 500 years.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's just a really, really cool thing.
And the stories from then are the same as the stories from today. So Texas history is a story of pre-Spanish, pre-French, pre-American, where you had a series of Native American tribes vying for Texas, just like the Six Flags vied for Texas. And so you have the Comanches coming in and pushing out the Apache, for example, or what have you, and all the different Indian tribes in Texas. Those are stories of people trying to come to this rough, very difficult place to make a living and do that. And it's a story of conquest and all of that occurred long before any Europeans came here. And so that's Texas history too. And it's interesting.
Are there any accounts that you've come across that you'll find a tribe or a tribal history more written or accessible than others? Is there one that sticks out in your mind?
No. The Kiowas would write down, they had a calendar, they called it a calendar, and they would record events that occurred since the last calendar. And I'd need to go look at my notes to know more details about that. One of those survives. I've seen it. there was an author, historian, scholar, ethnologist, really named, I think his name was Mooney, who wrote about the Kiowa calendar and was able to talk to, in the early 20th century, some of the surviving Kiowa and learn a little bit more about it and transcribe some of it, et cetera. So we can see how they recorded events of the late 19th century to some degree, but it's not history like we think of it. And so that's more difficult, because, but if you think about it, so you think about oral history, and which is a lot of the Native American tradition. Why isn't that regular history? I think it is, but what they're doing is they're teaching some facts, but also more important than the facts are the lessons. And we get awash in facts and forget the lessons. And that's particularly acute in today's academy, which I can speak to because I'm part of it. And it's one thing if you want to talk about a narrow set of facts, that's fine, but you lose perspective when you do that. So,
Whoa, you're still here. Awesome. Two things. Just wanted to tell you, if you're in Galveston or you know people who are going to be in Galveston, just visiting or live here, doesn't matter. I give tours. Galveston Running Tours started that thing. I'm doing tours on the weekend. Let me know if you want to go. GalvestonRunningTours.com or GalvestonUnscripted.com. There is a button or a link to my tours on Galveston Unscripted. So check that out. And as you can see, I'm interviewing some of the best people, the most knowledgeable people who actually know what they're talking about when it comes to history, Texas and American history. So you guys can literally watch me learn from the best and then come out and enjoy a tour with me. I keep it fun, high energy. You don't always have to run. We do walk-in tours too. So, all right, get back to that episode. Enjoy it.
One reason one thing I really wanted to talk to you about today was the transformation of your podcast from starting it out as, going way back, listening. It's 6-7 years old now.
Yes, 6 years old.
So it's 6 years old now, starting out in the beginning, kind of just putting this historical information out there, telling your stories into what it's become today, which I would venture to say it is one of the top Texas history podcasts out there.
It better be.
Yeah. I
don't mean it is. I know just from the statistics it is. And that's been a blessing. I wish I had more time to work on it. But it has changed the course of my life and the course of my history life. And it has made my public service, my day job, made history more important to me. The podcast has made history a bigger part of my life, which has really been an incredible blessing.
Do you find like math, it's easier to learn if you're teaching it? Do you find the same is true with history?
I think yes, and I think that's anything that you're doing. I mean, whether it's a sport or a academic subject or anything, music, I mean, whatever. If you're teaching it, you have to keep a perspective on it that, be able to explain it to other people.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. So it keeps me, the podcast, one of the things it does is it keeps me thinking about, reading about, talking about history. And that combined with my public service keeps me integrating history into which keeps that broader perspective fresh in my mind. So it's really been something.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to, what you were saying about oral histories. It's like you studying these things and putting it out there, and you have this history in your mind, and you go and you can tell these stories and relate back to these facts and kind of build some historical, content to put out there, whether you're speaking to a classroom or you're, actually putting it out on the internet, essentially.
Right.
So,
right.
And another thing I did want to ask you about is just the face of education today. And one thing I've noticed about my podcast is I started it out as a basic audio tour. And of course, it's evolved into this podcast is getting thousands of downloads every time I put out a podcast. And I'm hearing from teachers similar to you, teachers and even some universities who are like, hey, we added this to the syllabus because it helps tell this story so much better.
Right.
So do you think podcasting in general has changed the face of education?
I think it has. When I started the podcast in 2015, one of the reasons that I did it was I was shamed, not intentionally, by a historian who was a real hero of mine, and I won't name his name here, but he said, "What are you working on?" And I really wasn't working on anything. So I was consuming all this history for my own benefit, but I wasn't giving back. And so kids were little. I'm not going to have time to write a book, but I discovered there really wasn't a Texas history podcast. And so I thought, well, I could do that. It's like giving a speech. And so that's how it started. Mm-hmm. Well, like you, I knew I had something when the numbers started to grow, which is nice. But when I started getting emails from college professors saying, here's why what you're doing is important and I'm using it in my class, and I started getting invited to come speak at university classes on Texas history. And I look at it from a storytelling perspective, or at least I did then, not as a professor, but now I'm an adjunct professor of Texas history. Yeah. So, and now I have and I'm working on a master's in all of this stuff. And so now I have a broader perspective from more of an academic point of view on why history is important, which is a mixed blessing because I get to take the product and make it more relevant and more important. But I also see the problems that we're facing right now and which just inspires me more to make sure that people are getting history. And one of the things that I wanted to do with the podcast was communicate history in a new and different way, because hopefully people and younger people who would be more inclined to listen to podcasts would consume history. Now, they may not go pull a book off the shelf, but they'll listen to a podcast. So I really strive to give, certainly on the deeper topics, scholarly research. Now, you don't footnote a podcast, so it's not obvious, but the sources and stuff, the way I'm putting them together would pass any scholarly muster. And so that's important too. So you're really getting the way I put it sometimes is you're getting your vegetables, but they don't taste like vegetables. And so, and there's no reason that serious academic history should be as dry as it is 99% of the time. That's silly. Yeah. But, so there you go.
Yeah. You know, on my podcast, what I'll do is if I'm creating like the audio guide style, super short ones, 3 to 5 minutes, I'll go and find the most reliable scholarly or historic article I can possibly find. What I use to build that episode, take it and tie it back to the episode description or into into my website. Right. So, kind of linking it there. So if you do stumble upon it and you do like what you're hearing, make it easy to find, make it almost frictionless to kind of jump into.
Yeah, and you're better at that than I am. I should do that. My show notes are non-existent. So I know if I were a more professional podcaster like you are, I would do that, and I just don't have time, but I really need to do that. But, I get dozens of emails every week related to episodes that were years ago. And I'm always happy to respond with a list of books or tell people where to look. I do a lot of free research for people and try to figure, help them find their own family stories. But that's what keeps us all tied together. That's why history is so important.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And what you said earlier resonates with me is making it easy to find, easy to consume, and almost frictionless, because if you can make it easy to find, especially in today's age with TikTok and Instagram Reels and how quick those are. I kind of took that angle with it. It's like, keep them short and sweet. Just put all the meat in there, not the vegetables, right? Put it in there, and then have these interviews with people who actually know what they're talking about, who actually know the history, historians, authors, doctors, and then try to drive that traffic up the chain,
Yeah. So and it also demonstrates to your listeners how relevant it is to their daily lives. We all have a desire to understand the place where we are, whether it's a place that we live or our family or how we got here. We always want to know what happened to get us to where we are. That's just a human sort of instinct. Mm-hmm. And so we always want to learn our history. Mm-hmm. And so it's a great service.
Hey, if you are still listening, thank you so much. You are one of my biggest supporters. Really appreciate it. If you could do me one favor, if you're listening on YouTube, could you subscribe? Just click that subscribe button. That's all you got to do. It means nothing to you, but it means everything to us at Galveston Unscripted. And could you follow us on social media? We are everywhere. Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter. Just give us a follow. We just want to rack those numbers up. That helps us get the word out about transforming this place into the world's largest free museum. All right, get back to that episode. Enjoy.
Yeah, Well, it's fun. I mean, it's crazy that I've made it my career. I don't think I mentioned it to you. I worked in the maritime industry for almost 10 years. Went to A&M here in Galveston, graduated in 2015, but started working professionally in 2 years before I graduated. And during, through COVID, through the pandemic, I really shifted the way I looked at the world. I think a lot of people did,
Yeah, I think so.
And wanted to do something like take that Galveston running tours. Like people are enjoying this. They love, learning all these new little tidbits as we're running through downtown Galveston. Right. How can I continue to do that at scale? Yeah. And, through a lot of these thoughts and ideas, of course, I was listening to your podcasts and podcasts like Texas History Lessons and other ones, to kind of build all of this. So, it's crazy to me to think that I podcast for a living now. So yeah. It's nuts. So yeah, Galveston Unscripted is the official podcast of Galveston, and we're partnered with Visit Galveston. So basically creating content for Visit Galveston as well. Gotcha. And then helping other people and entities start podcasts.
Well, you will never run out of topics, and you never have to leave the island, and you will never run out of podcasts.
That's the thing. And you're so right. I get asked pretty consistently, are you ever going to run out of content? I was like, have you walked through downtown Galveston or walked through the East End or, and looked at a fire map from the 1800s? It's like, come on, you're never going to run out of it. And, from where we sit now, I can see it in the reflection. You have the Juneteenth mural over there. You have things like that. The Alyssa's, a few hundred yards away. You got all these amazing history that ties Galveston to Texas and American history. So.
Well, you got the battleship Texas, the only battleship to have fought in 2 world wars in dry dock almost within our vision. So, I mean, that's amazing.
So I understand. I won't keep you here all day. I promise.
Keep me here all day.
Yeah. So I understand you have Galveston roots.
I do. Mm-hmm. So you recently did a 1900 storm episode. So I did a 3-part 1900 storm episode. My great-great-grandfather is one of the people that survived the storm and gave a written account to the Rosenberg Library that collected these written accounts of storm survivors. And he was working at 23rd and Strand in a produce business as a salesman. And he went to work the morning of the 8th. And he came home for lunch. And it had started raining and the wind was whipping up, and clearly something was going on. By noon, on the 8th, the old sea salts knew what was happening, and his wife didn't want him to go back to work. And he said, don't worry about it. I'll go back to work. If it really gets bad, I'll come back home. Well, by the time he decided to come back home, he was swimming across. He bumped into the Rosenberg Monument, swimming at 25th, and ended up spending the night in a tree on 27th and Broadway. His daughter, my great-grandmother, was at home 6 months pregnant with my grandfather. And the whole family was in this house, and there's a picture. We have a picture of the house. It was knocked off its piers, but it didn't collapse. And so my grandfather was born on the island December 26, 1900. So obviously she survived, or I wouldn't be here. Yeah. But so on my mom's side of the family, all German, we have very, very strong ties. Arnold Wolfram was his name. I won't say his name, but and he's buried in here on the island. But so I've always felt a great affinity for the city, and everything that you talk about in 19th century Texas that's of a commercial nature or early settlement or anything like that. Galveston was very involved in that. And then, of course, before then, as you say, with Cabeza de Vaca and Galveston being the only natural deepwater port, everything happened here. Go back even, Lafitte and all those great stories. So everything happened here. And then my parents had a place here for decades and decades. So it's my second home for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny you say everything happened here. It's like, as I started to come to the realizations, like, how can I take this running tour to scale, this thing to scale? It's like, well, I'm sitting on a gold mine.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you have the access to the internet and can get on YouTube for about 10 minutes and learn how to start a podcast, you're sitting on a gold mine to get this history out there. So,
and everybody came to Galveston. So you've got American Indian history, Spanish history, French history. You got pirates, you got war, you got everything. The government of the provisional government of Texas on April 21st, 1836, was at the east end of Galveston Island on what is now the Coast Guard base. and had to be a messenger from San Jacinto. Benjamin Cromwell Franklin had to come tell them that the battle was won. Franklin then moved here and practiced law, was elected to the legislature, is buried here. So, I mean, Galveston's in everything.
Yeah.
Queen City of the South.
Yeah. So, okay, we've touched on a little bit of Native American history, a little bit on Galveston history. What are some of your favorite Texas history tidbits? I know that is, for having a top Texas history podcast, that's a really tough question.
Oh my
I'm
gosh,
sure,
I can't possibly think of a tidbit. I'm going to change the word.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm the judge. I get to change the word. I'm going to say aspects, and
Okay.
I want to say you can learn Texas history by picking your favorite subject that isn't history. For example, food. What's one of my favorite subjects. You can go through, I think the academic word for it is foodways. You can go through Texas foodways and go back in time and say, well, where did Tex-Mex come from? And you'll learn the history of San Antonio. Where did, in the history of the Chili Queens, where did kolaches come from? And you talk about the Eastern European immigration. Where does, you go back in the history of the education system, you get to the German immigration. And then all of a sudden you realize, well, gosh, let's talk about immigration. Let's talk about the different groups that came to Texas, as we mentioned earlier in this interview. And every group that has entered Texas on any scale has woven itself into the fabric of Texas somehow. Well, okay, if that's true, then Texas really is one of the most diverse places you can imagine. Well, let's go explore that. And the answer is yes, we are. And we always have been. Mm-hmm. And so the culture that we enjoy in 2022 has aspects of all of the different groups that have been here. Mm-hmm. And so the diversity of Texas, and I mean real diversity, not diversity, a buzzword. I mean the idea that you integrate different groups into one group and you take the strengths, the best of each, and you create a culture. And Texas has done that. And if you don't want to do food, do music, and you'll find the same answer. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's kind of my favorite way to look at Texas. And then within those, of course, are just incredible stories. But let me go back to tidbits.
Yeah.
Some of the cute, not cute, they're serious, but I mean interesting stories that I think are kind of fun to talk about. First kind of flying airplane was a Texan in 1865. I don't care what the Smithsonian says. The crash at Crush, this huge steam locomotive train crash that was staged outside of Waco. That's a fascinating story. You wonder why we were the pro wrestling capital of the world for a while. You go back and read that story about a staged train wreck, and you'll discover why. If you want to go talk about the history of rodeo, you're going to learn about the relations with the Comanches. There was a rodeo or what you could call a rodeo staged by a Texas Ranger and some Comanches in San Antonio, where they had riding contests and shooting contests between the Rangers and Comanches. It was all friendly and competitive and great. And I didn't learn that until I started did an episode on the history of rodeo. There's a boxing match held on an island in the Rio Grande when boxing was illegal that involved Wyatt Earp. And so, I mean, that's also a podcast episode. So,
I'm going to go find all these episodes and link them in the description of this episode.
I mean, they're just incredible stories. Texas, and I think it's really just kind of the nature, the type of person that it takes to settle here and the type of society we built, which was very entrepreneurial. It attracts all kinds of crazy characters. Yeah. And so we could go on and on.
Yeah. You know, it takes me back. So another thing that got me interested in history a few years ago was just my own family genealogy. Mm-hmm. My dad's from Michigan. My mom is family's from Louisiana. But previous to my grandparents here, I didn't think I had any ties to Texas. But going back, my fifth great grandfather was a New Orleans Gray. So he was a New Orleans Gray and killed at the Goliad. So just kind of crazy to find and trace that back. And and just like genealogy, you got to make sure double check every little connection. And then you find out the New Orleans Gray's flag is in Mexico City in a museum that Santa Anna captured.
Chapultepec Castle. Yep, I haven't seen it. I want to go down there and see it.
I do too. Maybe we should stage a
I want it back.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that. But yeah, the New Orleans Grays were a fascinating unit. Actually, you just reminded me of another funny story. So, they arrived in San Antonio, and they're firing at the Alamo during the siege of Behar. They're firing a cannon at the Alamo, and they're having a shooting contest to see if you could call your cannon shot. And so they're firing from a little redoubt that was about where the Wyndham Hotel is, and firing at the Alamo where the Mexican cavalry was. And so, again, this is 1835, so this is not the Alamo, the Battle of the Alamo. And they're betting on things. So this guy comes in amongst these New Orleans Grays and says, well, I want to participate. And they noticed that he was hard of hearing. And so they bet a brace of pistols against this guy that he couldn't do it. And he shot the ball right through a window. And it was Deaf Smith. And that's why he couldn't hear. And so, of course, later went on to be a hero of the Texas Revolution. Mm-hmm. That's another little cute tidbit. Yeah. But your five great-grandfather might have been there.
Yeah, he might have
lost some money to Deaf Smith.
I'm sure. I wouldn't be surprised. He was Irish, so so I'm sure.
Probably right in the middle of it.
Yeah. But yeah, so do you have anything big you're working on in the next few months?
Yeah, I've got tons of ideas. Listeners send me topics, and I put them all on a list. And the list is probably 300 things, and it just is a pure function of time. And so there are big episodes. One of the episodes I really want to do, it's going to be several parts, is the Council House fight, the Great Comanche Raid, and the Battle of Plum Creek, which are all tied together and were probably the most significant sequence of events in Texas Comanche relations. I want to do that. The Red River Wars, which were also the end of those fights, is important. I want to work on some 20th century Texas history, some more modern military guys, a couple of Medal of Honor winners I want to devote some serious time to. There's a ton of small stories. In the interest of getting content out there, I do some shorter episodes that are more humorous or whatever. I did one on the time that a Texas Navy ship landed at Cozumel and planted the flag. So as far as I know, Cozumel still belongs to the state of Texas. But there's some things like that. I think secession is something that I want to devote some serious time to, because that really is a Sam Houston story and a very interesting political drama. And I think it'd be good for all of us to think about it, especially since so many people now are like, well, we'll just secede again. And I'm like, yeah, I sympathize with it. But, I want to give that, I want to put some legal research out there and some scholarly research. The Civil War time in Texas, I haven't spent a lot of time on. That's a huge bunch of stories. I mean, it just goes on.
Well, I know the man
to
talk to about that one.
Yeah, that's right. Ed will be back on the podcast for that. So Juneteenth was really, I wanted to do that, and I was waiting on Ed's book to come out to do that. So I was blessed to be able to do that and then interview Sam Collins, as I know you have, our fellow Aggie. Yep. So that's important. There, speaking of Juneteenth, there's tons of stories of former slaves who went on to become extremely wealthy. And I think from a historical perspective, we need to tell those stories, because they weren't, they were entrepreneurs and businessmen and did wonderful work. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of those stories in Southeast Texas, particularly. Another big thing that I want to work on is ranching. Mm-hmm. And there are several guys, old cowboys that I happen to know, that have agreed to do it. And it's just, before they pass, I want to be able to get some of those interviews and
that's
kind
important.
of stuff.
That's important. Capture, I've had a few people on this podcast, Dale Olson and Lou Macbeth, who are in their late 80s. Yeah. And just the way they can tie the history, the people they knew when they were younger, those people were born in the 1800s.
Right.
And it really does tie you. When you're sitting there talking to them, it ties you back to the late 1800s, which is fascinating. So to talk to anybody in their 90s today, if they could tell you all they can and capture that on audio and video, I think that is imperative. Yeah. I really do.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, Justice Wise, thank you so much for joining me today. Is there anything else?
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Anything else you want to get out there to the world? Not that you need my platform.
Well, I want to tell everybody to listen to Galveston Unscripted and Wise About Texas, and and always, you have a part, you listener have a part to play in the fabric of the state, and learn the history and figure out what you can go and do for Texas. That's what I say at the end of every episode. Go out and do something for Texas. We are so blessed to live in this society, and we need to protect it. And it's the best place on the earth, as far as I'm concerned.
Hey, I can't top that one. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, JR. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to Galveston Unscripted and jumping into this episode with Justice Kenwise. As you can tell, we had a really good time talking about education and using these platforms that we have built to get the word out and how important it is. Make it easy, make it frictionless. That's what we're doing here in Galveston, transforming Galveston to the world's largest free museum, Galveston Unscripted. If you guys like Justice Wise and you don't subscribe to his podcast, he has a YouTube channel. He is on all podcast feeds, Wise About Texas. Go check it out. Go follow it. Go listen to it. You could listen to his podcast for weeks on end just without stopping. He's been doing it for almost 7 years now. So thank you so much for listening. Please like, follow, subscribe to this podcast wherever you find it. It means nothing to you. It takes 3 seconds. It means everything to us. And we'll see you next time on Galveston Unscripted. For historic resources or more information, check out the episode description.